First contact. Last warning. The ship sat on the frozen ground like three dark stones dropped from the sky. They were angular and sharp, built from a material that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. No markings, no windows, no familiar shapes, just clean, alien geometry that made Danny's stomach tighten the longer he looked at them. For several minutes, nothing happened. The ships just sat there, cooling, venting faint trails of vapor into the thin atmosphere. Danny kept his rifle trained on the nearest vessel and counted his own breaths to stay focused. Behind him, Private Sam Griffin crouched at the far end of the corridor with the second pulse rifle, his eyes locked on the external camera feed displayed on a wall-mounted screen. Then, the ships opened. Panels along the sides of each vessel slid apart without a sound, and figures began to emerge. They were tall, a full head taller than any human Danny had ever seen, and they moved with a smooth, fluid coordination that looked almost rehearsed. Their skin, what little of it was visible, was a pale bluish gray, and their bodies were wrapped in segmented armor that shifted and rippled as they walked, like the surface of water disturbed by wind. They carried long, staff-shaped weapons that pulsed with a faint blue glow at the tips. Danny counted them as they formed up on the frozen plain. 10 from the first ship, 20 from the second, 30 or more from the third. They spread out in a wide arc, facing the outpost, their movements perfectly synchronized, as if every one of them was hearing the same silent command. By the time the last of them had stepped off the landing ramps, Danny had counted at least 60. He keyed his comm and reported the numbers to Megan in the operations room. His voice was flat and controlled, the way he had been trained to sound when the situation was bad, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. 60 armed hostiles, unknown weapons, unknown capabilities, 6 defenders with sidearms, and 2 pulse rifles. Megan's reply came back just as steady. Hold position. Do not fire unless fired upon. She did not add anything to soften the order. They both understood the math. The aliens advanced to within 400 meters of the outpost and stopped. They stood in perfect lines, motionless in the biting wind, their armor gleaming faintly under the weak light. Then one of them, slightly taller than the rest, with a heavier build and additional plates of armor across its shoulders, stepped forward from the center of the formation. It raised a small device in one hand, and a burst of sound came from it. Distorted, crackling, but unmistakably human language. The words were flat and mechanical, as if they had been stitched together from recordings. We are the Veroth Dominion. The mineral resources beneath this structure are claimed as sovereign territory of the Dominion. You will surrender this facility. You will hand over all research data. You will submit to detention. Non-compliance will be met with immediate force. You have 1 hour. The transmission cut out. The tall figure lowered the device and stood still, staring at the outpost, with eyes that were dark and unreadable. Megan listened to the recording twice in the operations room, then activated the external speaker system. She identified herself by name and title. She stated clearly that Outpost Bravo 7 was a registered human installation operating under recognized interstellar treaty law. She requested time to contact her government for a diplomatic resolution. Her voice was calm, measured, and carried no trace of fear, even though every person in the room could see her hands gripping the edge of the console. The Varath commander did not respond. He simply turned and walked back into the formation, and the alien soldiers remained where they were, waiting. 1 hour. Megan moved fast. She pulled Leo aside and told him to compress everything: the sensor data, the visual recordings, the alien transmission, into a single burst package and send it on every military frequency they could reach. Leo worked with shaking hands but steady focus, his fingers flying across the console. The transmission went out in under 10 minutes. It would take 9 hours to reach the nearest military relay. 9 hours before anyone with weapons and ships would know what was happening on this frozen moon. Danny used the remaining time the only way he could. He pulled his team together in the central corridor and laid out the situation with no false comfort. 60 enemy soldiers against 6 of them. Unknown alien weapons against 2 pulse rifles and a handful of sidearm charge packs. No reinforcements coming for at least 18 hours, and probably longer. He told them the plan was simple. They were not going to win a stand-up fight, so they were not going to fight one. They would use the outpost itself as their weapon. The corridors were narrow. The doorways were built for humans, not for creatures a head taller. Every choke point, every corner, every sealed door was an advantage if they used it right. They got to work. Danny and Sam dragged heavy storage crates into the main corridors and welded them to the floor to form crude barricades. Katie Lane rigged the emergency lighting system so that sections of the outpost could be plunged into darkness on command. Private Greg Holt, a quiet kid from Texas who rarely spoke more than 5 words at a time, set up a fallback position in the inner ring using overturned lab tables and welding shields. Danny distributed the weapons. Katie and Sam each got a pulse rifle. The remaining 4 soldiers, including Danny, would fight with sidearms. He handed out every spare charge pack the armory had, and told his team to make every shot count, because when the ammunition was gone, it was gone. He moved the scientists into the deepest section of the habitat ring and sealed the blast doors behind them. Megan refused to go with them. She told Danny she would stay in the operations room and keep the comm channels open for as long as possible. He did not argue with her. He could see in her eyes that the decision was already made. The hour expired. There was no second warning, no final ultimatum, no dramatic announcement. A concentrated beam of blue-white energy struck the main gate and tore through the reinforced metal like it was paper. The blast sent shrapnel flying down the entry corridor and shook the entire outpost to its foundations. A second blast followed, then a third, widening the breach until the gate was nothing but twisted metal and sparking wires. Danny ordered his team to fall back to the first interior choke point. They moved in pairs, covering each other as they retreated down the corridor. The cold outside air rushed in through the breach, and with it came the sound of alien boots on metal flooring. The Verith entered the outpost in a tight column, their weapons up, their movements precise and deliberate. They were fast, faster than Danny had expected, and they moved with a confidence that told him they had done this before. They were not cautious. They were not afraid. They expected this to be easy. The first Verith soldier rounded the corner into Danny's field of fire, and he squeezed the trigger. The pulse round struck the alien in the center of its chest and staggered it backward. The armor absorbed most of the impact, but the creature stumbled, and Sam hit it with a second shot that put it down. Then the corridor erupted. Blue energy bolts screamed down the hallway, slamming into the barricades and sending sparks and smoke in every direction. Danny pressed himself against the wall and fired back, aiming for gaps in the alien armor. Katie held her position at the far end of the junction, her pulse rifle barking in short, controlled bursts that dropped 2 more Verith before they could advance. The aliens kept coming. For every one that fell, 3 more pushed forward to take its place. The barricades held for 8 minutes before the sheer weight of fire began to chew through them. Danny called the retreat, and his team fell back to the second choke point, then the third. Sam took a glancing hit to the shoulder that spun him into the wall. Greg dragged him behind cover, while Katie laid down suppressing fire that bought them precious seconds. Danny moved through the smoke with his sidearm in both hands, firing at shapes in the haze, feeling the heat of alien weapons passing close enough to singe the air near his face. They reached the inner ring and sealed the blast doors. Danny pressed his back against the cold metal and listened to the Verath on the other side, their tools already cutting through the locks. His ammunition was almost gone. 3 of his 6 soldiers were wounded. The blast doors would hold for minutes, not hours. In the operations room, Megan sat at her console and watched the feeds. She could see the aliens massing on the other side of the doors. She could hear the cutting tools working through the metal. She reached for the comm and opened every channel she could, broadcasting on every frequency the system could reach. Her voice was quiet but clear, and it carried out into the darkness between the stars. If anyone can hear this, we are still here. The wolves arrive. 9 hours earlier, while Megan Price was still watching 3 alien ships settle into orbit above her outpost, a compressed burst of data arrived at Deep Relay Station 14, a small automated signal hub floating in the emptiness between 2 star systems. The station's processors flagged the transmission as Priority 1 military, stamped it with a timecode, and bounced it along the relay chain at the speed of light. It passed through 3 more relay stations over the next several hours, each one amplifying the signal and pushing it forward. By the time the transmission reached Earth's Joint Stellar Command headquarters, it was the middle of the night. The duty officer read the header, turned pale, and picked up his phone. Admiral Pete Dawson was asleep in his quarters on the base when the call came. He answered on the second ring. He always did, and listened without interrupting as the duty officer read the contents of the transmission aloud. Hostile alien contact. 60-plus combatants. 23 civilians and 6 security personnel. No military assets within immediate range. Coordinates attached. Requesting immediate assistance. Pete sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and thought for exactly 45 seconds. He was 62 years old, with broad shoulders that had started to round with age, and a face carved with deep lines from decades of carrying the kind of weight that never fully lifts. He had made decisions like this before. He had sent people into danger before. It never got easier, and he never pretended that it did. He picked up the phone again and gave 2 orders. The first was to wake up every senior officer on the emergency contact list. The second was to send an immediate deployment order to the carrier ship Resolute, currently stationed 2 system jumps from KL-4. The Resolute was a Valor-class carrier, one of Earth's fast-response warships designed for exactly this kind of situation. Rapid deployment across multiple star systems to project human military power wherever it was needed. She was not the biggest ship in the fleet, and she was not the most heavily armed, but she was fast. She was reliable, and she carried something far more dangerous than any weapon mounted on her hull. She carried Fireteam Ares. The deployment order reached the Resolute at 0317 ship time. Captain Jake Morris was in the ship's small gymnasium, working through a set of pull-ups in the quiet hours before the morning shift. When his comm unit buzzed with the alert tone that every special operations soldier learns to recognize in their sleep, the one that means stop what you are doing and move, Jake dropped from the bar, wiped his hands, and read the briefing on his way to the team's ready room. He was 34 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with dark eyes that gave away very little, and a calm that other people sometimes mistook for indifference. It was not indifference. It was control. The kind that comes from years of walking into rooms where everything has gone wrong, and knowing that the first person to lose their composure is the first person to make a fatal mistake. He had grown up in a small town in Virginia, joined the military at 18, and moved through the ranks with a quiet efficiency that drew the attention of the people who recruited for units that did not officially exist. He had led more classified operations than most generals had even read about, and he carried every one of them in a place behind his eyes that he never opened in front of others. By the time he reached the ready room, his second-in-command was already there. Lieutenant Laura Webb stood at the briefing table, pulling up every piece of data the transmission had included. She was 31, with red hair cut short, and a mind that worked like a chess clock. Always thinking 3 moves ahead, always aware of how much time was left. She had earned her place on the team through a combination of tactical brilliance and a refusal to accept any plan that did not account for the worst possible outcome. The rest of the team filtered in within minutes. Sergeant Ethan Ward, the heavy weapons specialist, a big man from Montana who moved with a surprising gentleness until someone put a gun in his hands. Corporal Chris Blake, demolitions and breach, who could open any door ever built and several that should not have been possible. Sergeant Nate Sullivan, the team's medic and close-quarters combat instructor, whose hands could set a broken bone or break a neck with equal skill. And 7 more operators, each one selected from the best Special Forces units on Earth, each one carrying a skill set that had been sharpened through years of training and real-world operations that the public would never hear about. 12 against an unknown alien force that had already overrun a station. Jake briefed them with the little he had. A remote outpost on a frozen moon. An alien force calling itself the Verith Dominion. At least 60 combatants with energy-based weapons and unknown armor capabilities. 23 civilians and 6 lightly armed security personnel. Status unknown. The outpost layout was pulled from the Colonial Infrastructure Database. Narrow corridors, sealed habitat modules, limited entry points. It was not much to work with. Laura asked how old the transmission was. Jake told her it was already several hours old by the time it reached them, and it would take the Resolute approximately 7 hours to make the 2 system jumps to Kale 4 using emergency drive protocols. That meant by the time they arrived, the situation on the ground would be at least 16 hours old. Anything could have happened in that time. No one in the room said what everyone was thinking, that they might be too late. It did not matter. The mission was the mission, and they would execute it regardless of what they found on the other side. The Resolute's captain, Commander Diane Marsh, pushed the ship's engines harder than the maintenance crew was comfortable with. The first jump was rough, the kind that rattled the hull and made the lights flicker. But it shaved nearly an hour off the transit time. The second jump was smoother, and when the Resolute dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the far side of Kale 4, she did so in complete electronic silence, using the moon's mass to shield her approach from any sensors the alien ships might have. During the transit, Jake and Laura planned the assault using a holographic model of the outpost projected on the ready room table. They identified 3 approach vectors, designated fallback positions, and agreed on rules of engagement. Weapons free on any armed alien combatant. Protect all human personnel, and accept surrender if offered. Jake assigned roles based on the strengths of each team member, and Laura built a timeline that accounted for every second from shuttle touchdown to outpost breach. When the planning was done, the team spent the remaining time in silence. Some checked their weapons for the 3rd or 4th time. Some closed their eyes and ran through the assault in their minds. Nate Sullivan organized his medical kit and packed extra supplies for treating unknown energy weapon burns. Chris Blake laid out his breaching charges on his bunk and counted them twice. A single stealth shuttle detached from the Resolute's ventral bay and dropped toward the surface of Kale 4 in a low-signature descent pattern, hugging the terrain and using the ridgeline to stay below the detection threshold of the alien ships in orbit. Inside the shuttle, the 12 members of Fire Team Ares sat in 2 rows, strapped into their seats, helmets sealed, weapons secured across their chests. No one spoke. The shuttle touched down 2 kilometers from the outpost, behind a ridge that blocked all line of sight from the alien landing zone. The rear ramp dropped, and the cold hit them like a wall. Jake was the first one out, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, his rifle up and scanning the terrain ahead. He split the team into 3 elements with hand signals alone. Laura took a 4-person element and began moving north. circling wide to approach the outpost from an unguarded angle. Ethan took a two-person fire support element to a high point on the western ridge that overlooked the outpost courtyard. Jake led the remaining 6 directly toward the front of the facility where the Verath had concentrated their presence. They moved across the frozen landscape in complete silence, their advanced combat suits suppressing heat signatures and electromagnetic emissions. The wind covered what little sound their footsteps made. The Verath's sensors, designed for threats they understood, did not detect anything. It took 22 minutes for all 3 elements to reach their positions. Laura's team was in place at the northern access shaft. Ethan's team had a clear line of fire from the ridge. Jake's team crouched in the shadows just outside the shattered main gate, close enough to hear the alien language echoing from inside the outpost. Jake raised his hand, held it steady, and keyed his comm once, a single click. One by one, the other 2 elements responded with their own clicks. Everyone was ready. Jake lowered his hand, and the silence before the storm stretched out for one final, perfect second. The nature of wolves. The first shot came from the ridge. Ethan Ward settled behind his sustained pulse heavy cannon, lined up the cluster of Verath soldiers standing in the outpost courtyard, and pulled the trigger. The weapon roared, a deep, hammering sound that echoed off the frozen cliffs, and rolled across the plain like thunder. The first burst cut through 3 aliens, before they even had time to turn their heads. The second burst scattered the rest, sending them diving behind supply crates and landing struts, as chunks of ice and metal exploded around them. It took the Verath 4 seconds to understand they were under attack. By the time those 4 seconds had passed, Jake Morris was already inside the outpost. His element moved through the shattered main gate in a tight fluid formation. 2 operators on each side of the corridor, weapons up, each one covering the angle the person ahead of them could not see. They did not run. They moved at a controlled pace that was fast enough to maintain momentum, but slow enough to clear every corner, every doorway, every shadow. They had practiced this kind of movement 10,000 times in training facilities on Earth, and it showed in every step. The first Verath they encountered was a sentry posted just inside the breach, its back turned toward the gate as it watched the corridor leading deeper into the outpost. Jake put 2 rounds into the base of its neck, where the armor plates met, and the creature dropped without a sound. The operator behind Jake stepped over the body without breaking stride. They pushed deeper. The outer ring of the outpost was a maze of narrow corridors, storage rooms, and equipment bays, all built to human proportions, with low ceilings and tight doorways that forced the taller Verath to duck and turn sideways to move through. The aliens had been using these corridors for hours and had adapted to them, but adaptation was not the same as comfort. Every time a Verath had to angle its body to fit through a doorway, it lost a fraction of a second. Every time it had to lower its head beneath a support beam, its weapon dropped out of firing position. These fractions of a second added up, and Jake's team collected every one of them like coins. Outside, Ethan kept up a relentless barrage from the ridge. His spotter, a young operator named Tony Vega, called out targets as they appeared. Verath soldiers trying to regroup in the courtyard, others attempting to fall back to their ships, a few trying to set up a defensive position behind a stack of drilling equipment. Ethan hit them all. The heavy cannon was not a subtle weapon. It was designed to break things, and it did its job with brutal efficiency. The Verath in the courtyard were caught in an impossible position. They could not stay in the open without being torn apart by Ethan's fire. They could not retreat to their ships without crossing 200 meters of exposed ground. And they could not fall back into the outpost because Jake's team was already inside and pushing toward them. They were being squeezed from 2 directions, and the pressure was only going to get worse, because Laura Webb was about to arrive. Her 4-person element had circled wide to the north and reached the outpost's secondary access shaft, a maintenance entrance built into the upper level of the habitat structure, designed for external repairs, and rarely used. The hatch was sealed, but not reinforced. Laura popped it open with a manual override tool, and her team dropped into the maintenance corridor one by one, landing softly on the metal grating. The corridor ran directly above the inner ring, the section where the Verath had been pressing the Outpost defenders for hours. Through the grating beneath her feet, Laura could hear them. Alien voices, sharp and clipped, barking commands. The hum of cutting tools working through the blast doors that separated the Verath from the civilians they had come to capture. She held up a fist, and her team stopped. She pointed to the access ladder at the end of the corridor, then made a series of quick hand signals that laid out the next 30 seconds in precise detail. Her team nodded. No questions, no hesitation. They descended. Laura's element hit the inner ring from above and behind, dropping into the middle of a Verath formation that had been entirely focused on breaching the blast doors. The first alien went down before it even registered the sound of human boots on the floor. The second managed to half-turn before 2 rounds punched through its side armor. The third raised its weapon and fired a wild burst of blue energy that scorched the ceiling but hit nothing. The Verath formation collapsed. Aliens that had been standing shoulder to shoulder moments before were suddenly scrambling in different directions, their coordination shattered by the shock of an attack from an angle they had never considered. Laura's team moved through them with a cold, systematic precision. 2 shots per target, center mass, keep moving, do not stop. Deep inside the inner ring, Danny Cole heard it. He was crouched behind an overturned lab table, with Katie laying beside him, his sidearm in his hand, listening to the cutting tools work through the blast door in front of him, and waiting for the end. He had already decided that when the door came down, he would stand up and fire until his weapon was empty, and then he would use his fists, and then he would use whatever he could pick up off the floor. He was not going to kneel. He was not going to surrender. That was the only decision he had left to make, and he had made it. Then he heard the gunfire. Not the high-pitched whine of alien energy weapons, the sharp, heavy crack of human pulse rifles. The sound hit him like a physical force, and for a moment he could not move. Katie grabbed his arm and said one word, her voice breaking with something between relief and disbelief. Ours. Danny stood up, checked his sidearm, 6 rounds left, and kicked the barricade aside. He told Katie and the 2 other soldiers still able to fight to get behind him and move forward. They pushed through the blast door junction just as Laura's team finished clearing the corridor from the other side, and for one brief moment, Danny Cole and Laura Webb stood face to face in the smoke and flickering emergency lights. Laura nodded at him once and said, "Corporal, stay behind us." Then she turned and kept moving. In the central atrium, the battle reached its peak. Jake's element pushed through from the west. Laura's element closed in from the north. Danny and his soldiers pressed from the inner ring. The Verath were being hit from 3 sides, in a space that offered them no cover and no escape. Chris Blake reached a sealed blast door that blocked the main route to the atrium, and went to work without being told. He knelt, placed 2 shaped charges at the hinges, and 1 at the lock mechanism, and wired them in under 40 seconds, while Nate Sullivan and 2 other operators held off a Verath counterattack just 20 meters down the corridor. Nate fought with his rifle in one hand, and dragged a wounded operator to cover with the other. His movements smooth and unhurried, despite the blue energy bolts slamming into the wall beside his head. The charges detonated with a sharp, contained blast that blew the door inward. Jake led the surge through the opening and into the atrium. The Verath commander was there, the tall, heavy-armored figure that had delivered the ultimatum hours before. It stood in the center of the room, barking orders in its own language, trying to pull together a defense from soldiers who were already breaking. Jake saw it, raised his rifle, and fired twice from 40 meters. Both rounds struck the commander in the chestplate. The armor cracked, and the creature staggered backward, its dark eyes wide, with something that might have been surprise. It hit the ground and did not get up. The effect on the remaining Verith was immediate. Without their leader, the coordination that had defined their assault disappeared. Some dropped their weapons and sank to their knees. Others turned and ran toward the shattered main gate, only to be met by Ethan's fire from the ridge. A few fought on, firing wildly until they were put down by precise shots from operators who had already moved past anger and adrenaline into the cold, mechanical focus that defined them. Laura coordinated the final sweep. Every corridor, every room, every storage bay was cleared in sequence. Operators moved in pairs, announcing "clear" as they secured each section. The process was thorough, methodical, and took exactly 19 minutes. When it was over, Jake stood in the center of the atrium and took a breath. The air smelled like burned metal, melted polymer, and something sharp and unfamiliar that came from the alien blood pooling on the floor. 47 minutes. From the first shot on the ridge to the last room cleared. 29 Verith dead. 14 captured. The remainder had fled to their ships, which were now climbing toward orbit under the targeting lock of the Resolute, which had moved into open position above the moon, and was making it very clear, through every sensor and frequency available, that leaving was the only smart decision the Verith had left. Jake walked through the damaged corridors toward the operations room. He stepped over rubble, ducked under a collapsed ceiling panel, and pushed open the door. Megan Price was still sitting at her console, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, her face gray with exhaustion and streaked with dust from the shaking walls. She looked up at him with eyes that had been staring at screens for hours, watching her world come apart and then, impossibly, come back together. "You got our message," she said. Jake looked at her, and something shifted behind his steady eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. "We always do. What the stars remember." The first military ships arrived 31 hours after the battle ended. 3 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a tight defensive formation above Kale 4, their weapon systems active and their sensor arrays scanning every square kilometer of space around the moon. Behind them came a hospital ship and a diplomatic vessel, both escorted by armed shuttles that took up patrol orbits while the larger ships moved into position. Within hours, the sky above the frozen plain was busier than it had ever been. Shuttles descended in a steady stream, carrying Marines, engineers, medical teams, and a small army of logistics personnel who began setting up temporary structures around the outpost. Portable shelters bloomed across the ice like white flowers. Generators hummed. Communication towers went up. What had been the most isolated outpost in human space was suddenly the center of attention for an entire species. The wounded were the first priority. The hospital ship dispatched medical teams with equipment that Bravo 7's small infirmary could never have held. Danny Cole sat on a folding cot in the newly erected medical tent, while a Navy medic examined his ribs. 2 were fractured, cracked along the same line where he had been thrown against a wall during the fighting. There was also a deep laceration running across his left forearm that he had not noticed at all. The adrenaline had sealed it away in some back room of his awareness, and it was only now, in the strange quiet that follows violence, that the pain arrived. The medic told him he was lucky. Danny did not feel lucky. He felt tired in a way that went past his body and into some deeper place, the same tiredness he had felt after his last tour, the one that had brought him to this frozen moon in the first place. But when he asked about Katie Lane and Sam Griffin, the medic told him both were stable. Katie had taken shrapnel to her left leg, but would walk again within weeks. Sam's shoulder wound was clean and already healing. Private Greg Holt had a concussion and temporary hearing loss in one ear from an energy blast that had detonated near his head. but he was sitting up and eating. Danny nodded and said nothing else. He lay back on the cot, stared at the fabric ceiling of the medical tent, and let the tiredness have him. Megan Price spent the next 2 days in a series of debriefings that felt almost as exhausting as the siege itself. The diplomatic team that arrived on the second ship was led by a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Nolan, who asked questions with the kind of patient precision that Megan recognized from her own scientific work. Megan recounted every detail: the first sensor contact, the alien transmission, the decision to send the distress call, the defense of the inner ring, the long hours of waiting. When Patricia asked her how she had managed to keep her composure during the siege, Megan was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her hands, which were still raw from gripping the edge of her console for hours, and then she said, "I told myself that someone would come, and someone did." She paused. "I suppose that makes me either an optimist or a fool. I have not decided which." Patricia smiled at that, very slightly, and wrote something in her notes. The captured Verath were held in a temporary detention facility that the engineers constructed from reinforced habitat modules beside the outpost. 14 aliens sat in individual cells, their armor removed, their weapons confiscated. They were given food and water that the medical team determined was compatible with their biology, and they were treated with the same basic dignity that human military protocol required for any prisoner of war. The interrogations began on the third day. A team of military linguists and xenopsychologists worked with the Verath's own translation devices to establish a functional communication bridge. The process was slow and often frustrating. The Verath language had no direct equivalent for many human concepts, and the aliens seemed genuinely puzzled by several of the questions they were asked. But one exchange stood out above all the others, and it was the one that would eventually be repeated on every news channel and discussed on every world where humans had a presence. A woman named Nicole Ford conducted the interview. She was a senior intelligence analyst, calm and methodical, with a background in first contact scenarios that had until now been entirely theoretical. She sat across a metal table from a Verath officer, a mid-ranking commander whose name translated roughly to something like third voice of the outer reach, and asked him a simple question: "Why did you believe this attack would succeed?" The Verath officer regarded her with those dark, unreadable eyes for a long time. Then he spoke through the translator, and the flat mechanical voice filled the room. "We watched this place for many cycles. We counted your numbers. 23 workers, 6 guards, no warships, no heavy weapons, no strategic value. The resources beneath this ground are valuable to us, and you had placed almost nothing here to protect them. We calculated that the taking would be simple, that you would surrender rather than die for a place that means nothing. And what did you not calculate?" The Verath was silent again. When it spoke, the translator's flat tone could not fully hide what the linguists later described as a kind of bewildered respect. "We did not calculate that you would come. Not like this. Not so fast, and not so many. We did not understand why a species would send its most capable warriors across such distances, at such cost, for so few. The resources here are not worth what you spent to defend them. The people here are not leaders or generals. They are workers, diggers. By every measure we understand, this place was not worth fighting for." Nicole leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and looked at the alien across from her with an expression that was neither hostile nor sympathetic. It was something closer to certainty. "Then you do not understand us at all," she said. The news reached Earth within days, and from there it spread outward through every human colony, every relay station, every ship sailing between the stars. The story of Bravo 7 was told and retold, in news broadcasts, in barracks, in classrooms, in the quiet conversations that families had over dinner. The details varied, depending on who was doing the telling. But the core of the story remained the same. A small group of people had been attacked on the edge of nowhere, and their species had moved heaven and the stars themselves to bring them home. The wider galactic community took notice as well. Dozens of species had encountered humanity over the previous decades, and most of them had formed their opinions based on trade negotiations, diplomatic conferences, and the occasional border dispute. The Verath incident added something new to their understanding, something that many of them found difficult to categorize. Several species sent formal inquiries to Earth's diplomatic corps, asking for clarification on human military doctrine regarding the defense of remote installations. The responses they received were polite but consistent. Earth did not distinguish between installations based on strategic value when it came to the protection of human lives. Every outpost, every ship, every colony, no matter how small or how far from home, fell under the same umbrella of protection. This was not a recent policy. It was not even a policy at all, in the way most species understood the word. It was simply how humans were built. Admiral Pete Dawson held a press briefing at Joint Stellar Command. The room was packed with journalists, diplomats, and military officials from half a dozen allied species. A reporter in the front row asked whether the response to the Bravo 7 incident was proportional, given the cost of deploying a carrier-class vessel and an elite special operations team to rescue a small research crew on a moon with no strategic importance. Pete stood at the podium and looked directly into the camera. He did not smile. He did not hesitate. Every human life is worth the full weight of our response. That is not a policy. That is who we are. The room was silent for a long moment after that. Jake Morris and Fireteam Ares returned to the Resolute without ceremony. There was no parade, no awards banquet, no media appearance. They docked the stealth shuttle, stowed their gear, and filed their after-action reports with the same quiet professionalism they brought to everything else. When Laura Webb asked Jake if he thought the Verath would try something like this again, he considered the question for a while, staring out the viewport at the stars drifting past. "Not against us," he said. "On Kale 4, life returned to something resembling normal. The outpost was repaired and reinforced with stronger walls, better sensors, and a permanent military garrison that would have made the original security detail look like a skeleton crew. The scientists returned to their work. The drill bits turned, the samples were cataloged, and the data streams flowed back toward Earth, 9 hours away. Danny Cole stayed. When offered a transfer to a more comfortable posting, he declined. He told the personnel officer that he had gotten used to the cold, which was only partly true. The real reason was simpler. This was his post, and he was not finished with it yet. On clear nights, when the wind died down and the sky above Kale 4 opened up into an endless field of stars, Danny sometimes stood at the main viewport and looked up. He thought about the people sleeping in the habitat ring behind him, the scientists who would wake up in the morning and go back to studying rocks as if the universe had not tried to crush them. He thought about 12 soldiers who had crossed the void to stand in a place they had never been, for people they had never met, because that was the job, and the job was sacred. He thought about what the Verath officer had said, that by every measure they understood, this place was not worth fighting for. And Danny smiled, just slightly, because that was the part the aliens had gotten wrong. It was never about the minerals, or the data, or the strategic value of a frozen moon at the edge of known space. It was about the people. It had always been about the people. And now the galaxy knew something that the people of Earth had always known, that behind every quiet outpost, behind every small crew on every forgotten moon, stood the full and unwavering strength of a species that would cross the stars for its own. That was not a warning. It was a promise, and it was one that humanity intended to keep for as long as the stars kept burning. The Edge of Silence. The wind on Kale 4 never stopped. It moved across the frozen ridgeline in long, low howls that sounded almost like breathing, as if the moon itself was alive and restless. The cold was the kind that crept through walls, through insulation, through every layer of clothing, and into the bones. It was not a place anyone would choose to live, and yet 23 people called it home. Outpost Bravo 7 sat on the edge of a jagged cliff face, bolted into the rock like a steel barnacle clinging to the side of a ship. It was a small, rectangular structure, made up of connected habitat modules, a central operations room, a mess hall that doubled as a recreation area, and a series of underground drilling bays where the real work happened. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a collection of metal boxes half buried in ice. From the inside, it felt like a submarine, tight, warm enough to survive, and always humming with the sound of machines keeping everyone alive. Megan Price had been the station director for just over 2 years. She was a tall, thin woman with graying hair she kept pulled back in a tight knot, and eyes that always seemed to be thinking about 3 things at once. She had spent most of her career studying rocks on moons that no one cared about, and she preferred it that way. Politics, crowds, noise, none of that interested her. What interested her was the ground beneath her feet, and the stories it told about the universe. She was good at her job, respected by her team, and perfectly content to spend another 10 years on the edge of nowhere. The research crew under her was a mix of geologists, chemists, and engineers, most of them young, most of them here because the pay was good and the experience would look impressive on their records. They worked in rotating shifts, pulling mineral core samples from deep beneath the frozen surface and cataloging every layer, every compound, every trace element. The work was slow and repetitive, but Megan insisted on precision. She told her team the same thing every week during briefings. The universe does not rush, and neither do we. Communications with Earth took nearly 9 hours each way. A message sent in the morning would not receive a reply until the following day at the earliest. Supply ships came once every 3 months, dropping off food, equipment, and the occasional new crew member before disappearing back into the black. The nearest human settlement was 4 star systems away. By every meaningful measure, Outpost Bravo 7 was one of the most isolated places humanity had ever put a flag. The security detail reflected that isolation. 6 soldiers, led by Corporal Danny Cole, were assigned to Bravo 7 on a standard rotation. Their duties included perimeter patrols, equipment checks, and the occasional inspection of the external sensor array. In 2 years, the most exciting thing any of them had dealt with was a faulty airlock seal that had triggered a base-wide alarm at 3 in the morning. Danny was 26 years old, with short brown hair and a face that looked older than his age. He had requested the remote posting after finishing a difficult tour on a colony enforcement mission that had left him tired in ways that sleep could not fix. He did not talk about it much. He kept to himself, ran his patrols with quiet discipline, and spent his evenings in the mess hall reading paperback novels that he had brought in his personal kit. He was not the kind of soldier who sought glory or excitement. He was the kind who showed up, did his job, and tried to keep the noise in his head to a minimum. It was Danny who first noticed the change. He was running a routine check on the long-range sensor array when the screen flickered and displayed a cluster of contacts entering the moon's orbital path. 3 objects, moving in a tight formation, decelerating as they approached. They were not on any scheduled flight path. They did not match any known ship profile in the database. He called it in to the operations room. Dr. Leo Grant, the station's communications officer, pulled up the readings and frowned at his screen. Leo was a skinny man with round glasses and a habit of muttering to himself when he was thinking. He ran the contacts through every identification filter the system had and came up empty. He sent a standard hailing signal on all known frequencies. No response. He tried again. Silence. Megan came into the operations room when Leo called her. She stood behind his chair, arms crossed, and watched the three contacts settle into a stable low orbit around Kale 4. They were not tumbling. They were not drifting. They were holding position with a precision that ruled out any natural explanation. She asked Leo how long until the contacts could reach the surface if they chose to descend. He ran the numbers and told her less than 20 minutes. Megan did not waste time. She activated the base-wide intercom and told everyone to report to the operations room immediately. When the crew had gathered, scientists in their lab coats, engineers wiping grease from their hands, soldiers still pulling on their gear, she told them what was happening. 3 unidentified vessels were in orbit. They were not responding to hails. Their intentions were unknown. She gave her orders, calmly. Leo was to send an emergency burst transmission on all military and civilian channels, Priority 1, with the station's coordinates and a full description of the situation. Danny and his security team were to seal all external access points, move all non-essential personnel to the inner habitat ring, and prepare for the possibility of a hostile approach. The scientists were to shut down all non-critical systems and secure their research data. No one argued. No one panicked. They moved quickly and quietly, the way people do when they understand that the situation is serious and that wasting time could cost lives. Danny gathered his 5 soldiers in the main corridor. He looked at each of them and told them what he knew, which was not much. He told them to check their weapons, take up positions at the primary entry points, and stay on the comm channel. Private Katie Lane, a steady-eyed young woman from Ohio, asked him what he thought the contacts were. Danny told her the truth. He did not know, and it did not matter. Their job was the same either way. Leo sent the emergency transmission. It would take 9 hours to reach Earth. 9 hours before anyone with the power to help would even know they were in trouble. The outpost grew quiet after that. The machines still hummed, the wind still howled, but inside the station, every person was listening, watching, waiting. Then, through the external cameras, they saw it. The 3 vessels began to descend. They came down slowly through the thin atmosphere, their dark, angular hulls catching the faint light of the distant sun. They glowed at the edges, a dull orange heat from atmospheric friction. And they moved in perfect unison, like 3 fingers of the same hand reaching down toward the surface. Danny stood at the main airlock with his rifle raised. Through the frost-coated viewport, he watched the ships grow larger against the dark sky. His breathing was even. Behind him, the 23 people he was sworn to protect waited in the sealed inner ring, listening to the silence between heartbeats. The ships touched down on the frozen plain, and the ground beneath the outpost trembled. Whatever was about to happen, it had already begun.